Good evening, everyone. I cordially welcome all of you to today's National Science Day event. Science Day is celebrated in India on 28th Feb of each year to commemorate the great discovery, the Raman effect, by our own world-class physicist Sir C.V. Raman, for which he was awarded Nobel Prize in 1930. Sir C.V. Raman was a man of science. His admiration towards the world we live in, towards the nature, has always been very evident in his lectures and also in most of his philosophical quotes. So he was the one who said, if you ask the right question, Mother Nature will open the door of her secrets. So it's a pleasure to remember this legend. And this year's National Science Day event is being celebrated under the theme of Global Science for Global Well-being. It is in the light of India's G20 presidency. So to witness this special occasion, we have gathered here, and to grace this gathering, we have our formal DG of CSIR, Dr. Shekhar C. Mande, with us. It's an honor to have you, sir. So with all due respect, I invite Dr. Mande and our director, Dr. Radha Rangarajan, to kindly come on stage and occupy seats. Big round of applause, please. I request our director to kindly welcome him with a bouquet. Thank you, ma'am. Please be seated. Now we all settled. May I please invite our director, ma'am, to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, colleagues, guests, and my dear friends. A warm welcome to all of you. A special welcome to our former DG, Dr. Shekhar Mande, who has made the time to be with us today. I also welcome Sister Lab Directors, Dr. Bhaskar Narayan and Dr. Ajit Sashne, who are able to join us for this special celebration. As Shruti mentioned, National Science Day is celebrated every year to mark the discovery of the Raman effect by Sir C.V. Raman. So what did he actually do? He was, of course, a distinguished physicist, and he, along with his student K.S. Krishnan, discovered that when light traverses a transparent material, the deflected light changes in wavelength and frequency. And this is termed the Raman effect or Raman scattering, and forms the basis for Raman spectroscopy, which is now widely used by chemists and physicists to gain information about materials. And Sir C.V. Raman received the Nobel Prize in Physics for this discovery in 1930. I don't know whether all of you know this, but Sir C.V. Raman's entry into science was quite unusual. He was a brilliant student, and he had completed his master's. He studied physics, and then he wanted to do a PhD. He wanted to go abroad, but he was deemed to be too weak physically to travel and to go and do a PhD. So his options, therefore, were limited to staying back in India. And then he was unsure of what to do, but he decided to follow in the footsteps of his elder brother, who had joined the civil services. So he went on to write the civil service examination and then joined the Indian Finance Service as an accountant, and he was posted to Calcutta. He spent 10 years in the service. And during this time, during his walks back from the office, he would pass by the office of the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Sciences. And this is where he, and his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to go in and investigate, and soon he was doing experiments on the side during off hours, after office. And he was prolific during that period. He then went on to join. He left the services. He joined the University of Calcutta as professor of physics in 1914, and then, of course, he moved to the Indian Institute of Science in 1933. He established the Raman Research Institute, moving there in 1948, and stayed on there till he passed away in 1970. And his life, of course, is highly inspirational, and the Raman effect was discovered on the 28th of February 1928, and we commemorate that with a national celebration as National Science Day in India every year. So beyond honoring Sir C.V. Raman, this day reminds us of the central role that science plays in our lives. And when we talk about science, it means many things to many people, but for a community like ours, it is about research and development, and of course we work on drugs, diagnostics, and technologies. But for people whose work is not directly related to science, this day also draws attention to a scientific mindset. And that's a process which involves asking questions, testing a hypothesis, collecting results, collecting data, coming to conclusions based on data. And so, if you think about how Sir C.V. Raman's life unfolded, he was drawn to problems from nature, as Shruti said, like the glittering blue of the Mediterranean Sea and so on, which then motivated him to seeking answers. So today we have Dr. Mande join us to give a talk on the role of scientists and engineers in India's freedom struggle and beyond. And really, the talk takes us beyond science, I think, and I don't know exactly what he's going to talk about. I asked him briefly, and he said, "Oh, I just want to provoke you all, so we'll see." Promises to be entertaining. But I guess scientists can carry their scientific temper and approach to things beyond problems of science, quote unquote, and perhaps even towards institution building and nation building. We'll hear more from Dr. Mande. I could be totally wrong about what he's going to talk about, but I'm just taking a guess from the title. And I now pass it on to Dr. Mande to take it from here. Thank you.
No. I know everyone knows me, so no issue.
Still do a formal introduction because Shruti is prepared. Bhavna is. Come on. My bad for saying that, I pass it on to you. I didn't read my notes. Go ahead, Bhavna.
So definitely, we all know you, but still let's formally introduce you. There's more than DG about you to talk about. As we all know, Dr. Mande was Director General of CSIR and Secretary of DSIR, Ministry of Science and Technology. Prior to this, he was Director of DBT NCCS Pune. Dr. Mande supervised the launch of Indian Human Microbiome Initiative in the Northeast. He was the DG of CSIR when the world was hit by COVID-19, but he steered CSIR ably as DG under the difficult conditions of the pandemic. Under his leadership, repurposing of drugs against COVID was initiated, and I can proudly say that Umifenovir is one such repurposed drug by CDRI. Now it is not only licensed to a company, but also in advanced stage of large-scale clinical trial. He was instrumental in having MOU between CSIR and Ayush, and today CDRI has handful of projects being shaped under this umbrella. He is recipient of Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award, which is the most prestigious science award in India in the category of biological sciences. He has been elected fellow of all the three major science academies of the country, INSA, NASI, and Indian Academy of Sciences. Currently, Sir is Distinguished Professor at Savitribai Phule University, Pune, and also National President of Vigyan Bharati, which is a large-scale science movement in India with Swadeshi spirit. Today, he is here with us to celebrate this historic day, and we'll be talking about role of scientists and engineers in India's independence struggle and beyond. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I had to reset my stopwatch and start again. So, which I did. So, thank you once again for inviting me here and giving me the honor of talking to all of you on a very unique occasion when we are celebrating the National Science Day. And what I had requested, it should be branded, co-branded as an S20 event, as Radha very correctly mentioned, that India has the presidency of G20, and one of the verticals of G20 is Science 20, where we have been discussing issues related to the role of science for the benefit of mankind in general. About 5 or 6 verticals that we have decided that we are going to deliberate, and in September we'll bring out a paper that what India actually proposes to do, and other the G20 countries agree on that on this particular paper. And the first of those meetings will happen early next month in Agartala, where we are discussing things related to energy solutions, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, today we are celebrating the National Science Day, and Radha very correctly mentioned, it is on 28th February 1928 that Sir C.V. Raman announced the discovery of what today we know as the Raman effect. What Raman labeled at that time is a new kind of a radiation at that particular point of time. And what Radha correctly mentioned, that his curiosity was aroused when he was coming back on a ship from England in 1921, that he saw the Mediterranean Sea and he saw the blue color. And the explanation of blue color till then was it is because of Rayleigh scattering, which he felt was not correct, that explanation. He did experiments on the ship and showed that explanation was not right. So, and eventually, of course, what Raman said was proved to be correct. But in 1921, Raman was sent to UK at the persuasion of Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, who was then the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University, and he had brought Raman to Calcutta University as the Palit Professor. He had brought 2 Palit Professors to Calcutta University then. One was Acharya Praful Chandra Ray, which we'll talk about a little later. Another was Raman. And Raman was earning about double the salary when he moved to Calcutta. So he took a huge salary cut and moved there. And in his own admission, he said that he was very inspired after reading this particular poem, that some of you should do Google on this and if possible read the poem, something called Light of Asia by Thomas Edwin, if I'm not wrong. He was the director of the Deccan Institute in Pune long ago. This Light of Asia poem has turned out to be inspirational to many, many people, not only Raman, but even people like Gandhi, Ambedkar and all. They were highly influenced by this particular poem. And very recently, Mr. Jairam Ramesh has written a biography of this poem that also is very readable. So it's a very nice thing. It talks about Buddha, the renunciation, and how we actually work for society, the Eightfold Path, and so on and so forth. It's a very nice thing to actually read about and take inspiration from those times. But Raman, when he came back, he started pursuing his work on 3 different lines, all related to scattering of light. And what he had hypothesized is that a few years before Raman discovered his effect, there's something called Compton effect. Some of you would have heard, Arthur Compton had discovered that when X-rays are incident on material, they knock off inertial electrons, because of which there is a vacancy which is created, and the vacancy, when it is filled by outer shell electrons, at that time a wavelength which emerges from these atoms is a higher wavelength or low energy. In a sense, what Compton was showing is that light is particle that exchanges energy with material, and essentially the photons give energy to the material, and therefore the emerging photons, the scattered photons, have energy which is lesser than the incident photons. So that's the Compton effect. And Raman thought that this needs to be generalized because light can interact with matter both ways, absorb energy as well as give energy. And he had hypothesized this, and he had requested K.S. Krishnan to set up experiments. And on 21st February 1928, K.S. Krishnan indeed confirmed Raman's notion that what he saw was some sort of a weak fluorescence that came out of incidental beam on a liquid, and he reported to Raman. And Raman and his very famous technical person who used to help him, very famously called as Ashuda, they set up an experiment on 27th February 1928 to check whether K.S. Krishnan's things are right or not using a spectroscope. And unfortunately, the sun went down by the time they set up the experiment. So on 28th February, they set up the experiment and indeed found that you had bands of lights on both sides of the incident wavelength. So incident wavelength, of course, comes out as it is, but the incident light gives energy to the material, the liquid at that time that what they are using, also absorbs energy from them. So therefore, you get bands on either side. And very quickly, on 28th February, he announced the discovery, what today we call as Raman effect, but then it was called what Raman himself preferred to call a new kind of a radiation. And he sent a paper, he and K.S. Krishnan sent a paper to Nature. Nature promptly rejected the paper. The referees said that is nothing new in the work. But thankfully there was an editor who thought that there's something new. So editor accepted the paper. And it was published in Nature on 31st March 1928. And almost the rest is now history. Now, referees rejecting papers is not new to any one of us, right? I mean, we all have gone through this. And particularly foreign journals, anything coming from India, we need much more rigor than what you would, similar work coming from some other countries, which is true by and large. It is not really what we feel and is anecdotal, but I guess most people have gone through this. And some sort of a feeling that science which is done in countries like India, Bangladesh or something is perhaps not as rigorous as that is done in the Western countries, Western Europe or US or something like that. And that feeling actually continues even today. And that was one of the biggest problems that during freedom struggle, that the people who were fighting freedom struggle, they had to face, that we were always considered to be inferior to a particular kind of population that came from Europe, so the colonial powers. Right, in all respects, whether it be our education system, whether it be our culture, whether it be the scientific development that were in the country, that was considered to be inferior to our colonial powers. And there are plenty of evidences in history which actually point out to this. Right, I mean, and these days, people like Shashi Tharoor and all have really gone aggressive, trying to document that how we were plundered by our colonial powers in their 190 years of rule. Right, I mean 190 because we are considering from roughly 1757 to 1947. That's the period that we consider as the colonial occupation. Although the real colonial occupation was complete in something like 1818 after the Anglo-Maratha wars, but nonetheless, I mean, we'll consider from 1757 onwards. So there's one major difference between all other people who came from outside or other parts of the geography and they fought wars here. There are 2 or 3 major differences. So many other people who came from other geographical parts to India and fought wars here, number one, they came here to integrate themselves with the local population here. So most of them stayed back in India and they actually contributed richly to our culture and history and everything later on. So there was one major difference, that a colonial people, that is the British, had no intention of doing that. Although a handful of British stayed back, but the number of British families that stayed back in India is not more than 5,000. So other people who came from outside, from different parts, whether be it Middle East Asia or from some other routes, they actually stayed and made themselves part of India and became part of our culture. Number 2, British actually brought a very strong component of science and technology that probably was not up to the mark when, or rather it was not deployed in that particular respect to stop their aggression in India. And that is reflected by a large number of things that the British, after the 1757 thing, that they started doing in the country. For example, they started very early on something called Survey of India. One of the first, if you go to the DST website, they will tell you the first scientific organization in the country as an organization is the Survey of India, today what we call as Map Survey of India, of which George Everest was one of the first director generals, right? And the Everest Peak has been named after Everest, although in the minds of many of us, it should have been actually named Radhanath Sikdar Peak, because the person who had estimated the correct height of Mount Everest was Radhanath Sikdar and not George Everest himself. So nonetheless, the British started many organizations, and they actually started use of science and technology for this. They started Botanical Survey of India, they started Zoological Survey of India, they started Geological Survey of India, and so on and so forth. And the overall objective was to actually use our natural resources, and in the process, they becoming more prosperous country. That's the overall, by and large, objective is what we can actually consider. Even the railways were established to carry goods from one place to the port city, so that they can carry these goods to UK and make finished products and come back and sell them here. Now, there are many different kinds of things that we can actually talk in trade, in terms of trade. And all of us know about clothing and so on and so forth. They're a part of a glorious part of our independence struggle, that how clothes were made in Manchester and brought here and all. But nonetheless, I mean, to give you an example, where the CSIR is very closely, intricately related, is that of leather. So the leather industry which existed in India, British actually kind of killed it. And the only thing that was allowed to do in India was produce raw hides and skins. And these were actually taken to Europe. The finished leather products were made and they were brought back here, and they were sold here. So at the time of independence, India's entire leather industry employed about 25,000 people, right? And all the leather industry that existed in India was preparation of raw hides and skins. They were sent overseas. And this was corrected eventually in 1970. There's a very famous Sitaramaya committee which actually banned the export of leather and said that leather products can be made in India. CSIR was given the task of making leather processing chemicals, the equipment for processing leather, and for training people in leather industry, people who can actually do leather. And leather industry actually employs a lot of informal sector even today, making finished products and so on and so forth. And today, therefore, what we see, and CSIR's footprint is very proud to see that, is that today leather industry in India employs about 45 to 50 lakh people, right? Instead of 25,000 in 1947. And today India's export in leather is $5 billion US. About 45 to 50 lakhs, approximately 30% of them have been trained directly in CSIR. They have come to CLRI, stayed there, and they have actually studied in CLRI for doing this. Now that's actually what we have done post-independence, but pre-independence it was like this. Now, as I said, the colonial powers, and those of you have heard Shashi Tharoor, or those of you have read his beautiful book, An Era of Darkness, he says whole lot of things there. He says that the first, and this probably is known to all of you, he said the first English word that ever made to Oxford Dictionary, some of you could guess, was loot. The first Indian word that made to Oxford England Dictionary was loot, and that is Shashi Tharoor, okay, not me. And that actually signifies what the British did in India. If you look at the history of famines in India, it's pathetic. Look at some of the pictures, the famines in India. Roughly about 10 years after 1757, the first of the famines struck India, and about 1 million people died in that. And that continued till 1943. And the apathy of the rulers was such that 1943 famine was a completely avoidable famine. But about 1 to 3 million people died. 1 to 3 million is 10 to 30 lakh people died in the famine. Can you imagine today 30 lakh people dying in a famine? And the famines consistently came since about roughly 1770 onwards till 1943. Every 25 years there was a major famine in the country. And there was a huge mismanagement on the part of our colonial powers. Right? Agriculture had become unsustainable. In the 18th century in India, before the colonial powers arrived here, it is recorded in literature that, and there's a very beautiful book, something called Science and Technology in 18th Century India by a person called Dharampal. It's a very readable book. He has actually documented from official records how science and technology was in India. And one of the chapters is devoted to agriculture. And agricultural productivity in regions such as Tanjore today, the productivity of rice matches today's maximum productivity of rice that exists in Japan. Per hectare productivity of rice in India in 18th century is equivalent to what is seen today in Japan. This entire agriculture industry was killed the taxation was so heavy in Bengal that Bengal actually stopped producing any agricultural produce during British time. It's amazing. The practices that they followed was simply like this. And of course, we were completely berated as a nation of snake charmers, a nation of tiger watchers, a nation of elephant riders, with complete lack of respect for what actually has happened here for centuries. It's only now that world is coming around and recognizing the fact that in 18th century, the science and technology was highly developed in India. And in fact, people like Michael Faraday and all were taken aback by the kind of metallurgy that existed in India. Just to give an example, when British came here, they used to prepare steel using a process called Sheffield steel. Some of you would have heard what Sheffield steel actually is. But when they came here, they found that in the regions in the south, particularly Mysore and all, a process of making steel, something called wood steel, existed. And wood steel essentially is taking iron ore, mixing it with some bamboo leaves that actually acts as charcoal. And the charcoal is actually mixed in a content roughly about 0.1 to 0.3%. And then it is actually put in crucibles, and then it is baked. So you put it in oven at roughly about 1500 degrees Celsius or something. And that's how the wood steel was made. Now wood steel was very famous because there are records in something like 6th and 7th century AD that steel from India used to be exported to many other countries, including the Middle East. And then some of the thing that used to be made there, what we call today, is known in history as Damascus sword. That you would have heard. Damascus sword used to be made from Indian steel, the way Indian steel was made. And a Royal Society delegation, when it visited India in the 18th century, they were taken aback that how come this process is better than the Sheffield steel. And Michael Faraday himself is on record saying that the process of making steel in India is much superior than actually the Sheffield steel. This is on record. So this kind of science and technology existed here, but of course we were berated as snake charmers. So that's a different aspect altogether. It is under this background that some people took upon themselves saying that if British are using science and technology as the principal tool for ruling over us, we must also develop our own science and technology, and we must not forget our very traditional schools of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and so on and so forth that have contributed very richly to Indian development of Indian thought. And it is under that background, many people actually started the efforts, building institutions and bringing science and technology and industry together at that particular point of time. And one of the foremost names of this, is Radha also mentioned, was the formation of Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, sometimes around 1850s, by none other than Mahendralal Sarkar. So he and a few other group of people got together and said that we must have an association where we can promote people doing science in that particular association. And some other people also joined as time progressed in this particular movement. Of course, when C.V. Raman joined the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, unfortunately Mahendralal Sarkar was not alive, but his son Amrutlal Sarkar was alive, and C.V. Raman requested him that can I do experiments in cultivation of science, and of course Amrutlal Sarkar agreed to that particular suggestion. But also names like J.C. Bose, and I will come to a small story about Bose and a small story about P.C. Ray. So we'll talk about P.C. Ray first. So P.C. Ray was educated in Edinburgh in chemistry. All of us know that, he was extremely famous chemist then. His process of making mercuric nitrite was very famous. He had become famous because of that. And when he came back to India, he actually started with great nationalistic spirit teaching chemistry to next generation students. And some of his students were likes of Meghnad Saha and all when he was teaching in presidency. And because of the continuous berating by the British about Indian science, he took upon himself to chronicle India's history of chemistry. And he wrote a book. Do Google or do Amazon, you will find a book called History of Hindu Chemistry, written by P.C. Ray. It's a beautiful book about development of chemistry in India since time immemorial till about 16th century. Just to tell the British that science did exist here and was as good, or rather it was at a stage which was more progressive than the West at that particular point of time. right? And PC Ray's thing was, of course, very famous, but PC Ray also was a great nationalist. He thought that creation of jobs is an extremely important thing. And for creation of jobs, he created a company, as all of you probably were aware, a company called Bengal Pharmaceuticals and Chemicals, Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals. That company exists even today. It's unfortunately a sick PSU today, but nonetheless, it was founded by PC Ray. And that was actually to promote the job creation amongst youth. So not only was he an outstanding chemist himself, but he also recognized the fact that industry must work closely with scientists so that we can actually promote creation of jobs, but also we can promote industrialization of the country on par with other advanced economies in those particular times. Now, this fact also was realized by many other people around the same time. And that brings me to the story that all of you are aware of, a chance meeting between Jamshedji Tata and Swami Vivekananda. Probably the students may not have heard the story, but the elder people all have heard the story, that when they are traveling together on a ship in 1893 to Canada from Osaka, at that time, by chance, Swamiji and Jamshedji Tata happened to be on the same ship, and they got together and talked quite a few things in those times. And one of the things that Swami Vivekananda proposed to Jamshedji Tata, that India must have centers of higher education and learning, which instill Indian thought in these people, not necessarily the Western thought. And Jamshedji Tata actually readily agreed to that. And as a result of that, eventually in 1907, what came into being is today what we call as Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. So that actually is a direct consequence of the conversation between J.N. Tata and Swami Vivekananda. So that's how actually things were happening, that industrialists had started taking interest in promoting science and technology. Those of you who are aware, a very famous industrialist called Abdul Khwaja Hamid, he started something called CIPLA in 1920s in Mumbai, and that also was started to promote pharmaceutical industry in India, so that Indian knowledge can be integrated into the pharmaceutical industry. And that was the dream of Abdul Khwaja Hamid. And in fact, once again, CSIR has a very close connection to Abdul Khwaja Hamid, because he was the member of our governing body for almost 20 years in the beginning of CSIR. And his son, his prodigal son, has come to CDRI, I believe, a number of times, right? Yusuf Hamid. Basically the nationalistic spirit that was there amongst people like Swami Vivekananda, Jamshedji Tata, PC Ray, Bose, Mahendralal Sarkar, actually had started pervading everywhere, so that science becomes a powerful tool for most of our struggles and to take on the British. And one of the first incidences of defiance came in form of none other than J.C. Bose. J.C. Bose actually defied the British authority for the first example, today what we call as Satyagraha. The first Satyagraha was not the salt Satyagraha, but J.C. Bose's Satyagraha preceded that by at least 20 years. So the story is like this. Bose was in London, and he had actually demonstrated in Calcutta and also in London that signals could be transmitted at a distance, and he was clearly ahead of Marconi in particularly demonstrating this particular experiment. Today the world has recognized that discovery should be credited to Bose and not to Marconi for this particular one, for the wireless communication. But the experiment that he was doing, J.C. Bose, was the effect of external perturbations on electrical signals in plants. So that's the experiment that he was performing. And then he was ridiculed. When he gave a talk in Royal Society, he was ridiculed by people that how can you even do experiment like this? That you give some perturbation, environmental perturbation to a plant and try to measure electrical signal. And what he found, that there was indeed a change in electrical signal in response to that perturbation. Now the phenomena was not very well understood, and he thought that he should actually study this. But everyone discouraged him to perform this experiment. So he gave up in England. And later on, a few months later, he realized that two British people who had attended his talk in Royal Society published the paper on their name. Right? Now, it happens even today, right? So, Bose was frustrated, and he wrote to Tagore saying that how frustrated he is about this. So Tagore encouraged Bose to come back. He said, you please come and take up a job in India. This is your country and you work here. So Bose took up a job in Calcutta. And at that time, he was offered a salary which is much less than what a white-skinned person would get, right? Saying that Indians cannot think rationally, and therefore when you teach, you don't deserve salary which is equivalent to a white person in the university as a professor. That was the Bose first tell. What Bose would do, Bose refused to take salary. So he worked without salary for 2 years, but yet he taught. So he did not falter from his duty of teaching students, but he did not take a single pay salary. Now that, to minds of many of us, is the first real example of a satyagraha. That he was actually insisting upon his rights without faltering in his duty to the society. And when British actually realized their mistake, that indeed they had committed a mistake, they restored full salary to Jessie Bose at that particular point of time. But by then, many people had realized that Bose was way far above than doing work like this. Many people had recognized that Bose, today what we call, was a real Nobel matter. And his discovery of the wireless, of course, was phenomenal. But also the plant work that he was doing was extremely good. And once again, Tagore, Swami Vivekananda and others, they convinced Bose that he should start thinking of starting his own institute somewhere. Unfortunately, Swami Vivekananda passed away in between. But Sister Nivedita took over and she tried to get the first funds for Jessie Bose. And then she convinced a lady called Sarah Chapman Bull in US to give Bose an amount that was equivalent to the Nobel Prize. So that amount of money was given to Jessie Bose to start an institute in Calcutta, what he called as the Basu Vigyan Mandir. You know, the Bose Institute that you see today is none other, but that was started by him with a grant that he received from Sister Nivedita. And then he started performing experiments there in that particular one, and rest once again is history. So these are the kind of people who actually existed then, who were actually very fervently nationalistic. And they wanted to do things in India. They wanted to make sure that India also is globally seen as one of the scientific nations, science and technology nation, and not as a nation of snake charmers, the narrative that was passed on by the British. And in fact, India's medicinal history, all of you are aware, is a very, very rich medicinal history. And none other than Sir Henry Wellcome. I don't know whether I've told this story in my past talks in CDRI. Henry Wellcome, all of you are aware of the name. Wellcome Trust. Today, all of you know what Wellcome Trust is. This is the world's largest charity biomedical funding organization on today's date. It is bigger than HHMI and bigger than Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of funding biomedical research. I'm sure there are a couple of Wellcome Trust scholars here in this particular audience. Henry Wellcome, in 1911, he sent a doctor, Sarah Paul, to India with a mandate to go to India and ransack the complete medical knowledge that exists in India. And do not come back unless you have understood the entire Indian medical system. Because Wellcome Group of Industries wanted to exploit this knowledge for their own commercial gain. That's how Henry Wellcome was. But nonetheless, Indian medicinal system has of course been extremely rich. It's now, only now in the last few years, people have started addressing health as an issue which is holistic and not because one disease, one cause, one organic molecule to suppress that cause. There's the paradigm that has evolved in the last 100 years, that you have one disease, you identify one cause, either a gene mutation or a bacterium or a virus, and suppress that cause by one single organic molecule. This is the modern paradigm. While the classical paradigm that we grew up in the Indian medical system is look at it more holistically. Health is a combination of many different things. Any disease is a combination of many different parameters, not a single parameter. And it's only now that the world is coming around and actually recognizing this particular fact. And it is the time that we recognize ourselves that Indian system of medicine was very rich, it was documented, and it came by very subtle observations around us. And therefore, we should try to understand the Indian medical system or the traditional Indian medical system from the modern perspective. That's the job we should take upon ourselves and try to do that. So to give you some of the examples, I told you about P.C. Ray, I've told you about Jessie Bose, I have told you about Swami Vivekananda. There are many others who actually participated in a very fervent nationalistic spirit in this thing. So J.C. Bose, as I said, also made a protest. P.C. Ray actually prepared a generation for launching protests against the British, and so on and so forth. There are 2 or 3 other names that also stand out in India's history and persisting with the British of what they ought to do in India and what they ought not to do. And one of the name is that of S.P. Agharkar, that some of you probably would not have heard. S.P. Agharkar was a professor of botany in Calcutta University, and after he retired, he came back to Pune and he started an association, something similar to Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, something called Maharashtra Association of Cultivation of Science in Pune. But S.P. Agharkar's real contribution was he stopped British taking some of the rarest botanical species to England. At that time, British actually were taking all kinds of things to England and actually trying to study them there, and he actually stopped them. But he also recognized that there's something called 1851 fellowship that Britain had promised to India. 1851 was a year when there was a big industrial exhibition that happened in London. And most of the funding to this particular exhibition came from Indian royalty. The Maharajas of India, they actually funded that. And much of it actually remained as a corpus later. And the British said that we will use this money to train Indians in the modern ways of science and technology. But British being British, they forgot about it. It is only in 1920s that S.P. Agharkar realized that this is a fact. So he pursued with the British government then and made it sure that 1851 fellowships are reinstated. And the first person who took benefit of 1851 fellowship was none other than Homi Jahangir Bhabha. So he was the first person who got the 1851 fellowship, went to Cambridge, did wonderful work, came back, and once again the rest is history. So there are people, as I said, who were very, very nationalistic, and they expressed their nationalism in many different ways. The scientists and technologists, they expressed their nationalism, they contributed to the society, they made sure that our science really does not go down, but we actually survive at whatever levels. And C.V. Raman, of course, whom we are celebrating today, was also a very, very nationalistic person. So C.V. Raman, when he went to receive the Nobel Prize, the records state that he was greeted by the British ambassador there, maybe to the in Stockholm, and the ambassador walked up to him and he said, "Hey, Professor Raman, congratulations, but I have a bad news for you. Your good friend, we have had to take him into custody. He is in jail today in Delhi." And all of you can imagine who the good friend would have been. There's none other than Mahatma Gandhi, who was taken to jail. And Raman became a bit emotional because on the day of his glory, he was being told that your friends who are actually doing somewhat nonsensical things in their view are being now treated or being dealt with very firmly in India. That's how the Nobel Prize ceremony began for Raman. But Raman had taken this as a personal triumph. His Nobel Prize in 1930, he had taken it as a personal triumph. And Raman was a very supremely confident person, today what we call a supremely arrogant person. But he was supremely confident, and believe it or not, you know that Nobel Prizes are announced in the first week of October, right? 8th, 9th, 10th October are the Nobel Prizes when they are announced. In 1930, Raman bought a ticket for himself and his wife to go to Stockholm in the month of June, right? A few months before the Nobel Prizes were announced, he bought a ticket. He knew that he was going to get a Nobel Prize. And that's the confidence of him. So he actually entered the ceremony with great confidence. And then when he received the Nobel Prize, by accounts of people, those who were there in Nobel Prize ceremony, and Shiv Ramseshan, the former director of Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, has beautifully written this account in Current Science some time ago. And he wrote that Raman received the Nobel Prize, he came back and sat in his chair, and that time he realized that the flag which was flying behind his head was Union Jack and was not an Indian flag. And because the ceremony had started on a wrong foot, he had been told that Mahatma Gandhi had been taken into the custody. And then when he realized that although it is his personal triumph that he was winning the Nobel Prize, he truly represented people of India in that ceremony. And that's his own personal account that he eventually gave to people like Ram Seshan and all. And then he broke down. He started crying. And the journalistic accounts of that ceremony are there, which said that the entire evening ceremony was carried over by this turbaned Indian who was sobbing uncontrollably in the hall. And that was the nationalism of Raman, saying that my poor country, in his own words, my poor country did not even have a flag of our own. And that is in 1930. And that's what actually we celebrate today, Raman's spirit of his inquiry of nature, but also the spirit of the scientists that actually worked in pre-independent India to make sure that we actually don't lag behind the modern science and technology. And some of the scientists who made contributions to modern science and technology of that era are amazing. I don't think we see those kind of figures today for some reason. But people like S.N. Bose, people like J.C. Bose, people like Meghnad Saha, people like Raman, people like Sir Vishwesvaraya, the list goes on and on and on. And some of the tallest leaders of humanity, whether it be Swami Vivekananda or whether it be Mahatma Gandhi, they are all some of the tallest figures that world has ever produced in last several centuries. They all came from India, right? And we have to recreate that particular era once again. So the responsibility of our generation is to actually recreate that era where we once again have tall leaders in every field as that existed in the pre-independent era. What I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of stories about the post-independent era, how we actually developed modern India post-1947. And what we should do is let's look at a couple of CSIR examples that the scientists here would be aware, but the students may not be aware, that how we confronted different issues in India. Of course, all of you have heard of Green Revolution. 1943 was a very bad famine, I told you. About 1 to 3 million people died, 10 to 30 lakh people died in Bengal in this famine. A famine-like situation was there in 1965 once again. It is at that time the government decided very firmly that they would actually get over the situation by implementation of scientific principles. They invited Norman Borlaug. C. Subramaniam was the agricultural minister. There was a IAS secretary called Shivram. And of course, the responsibility came upon Swaminathan to implement the Green Revolution. But also responsibility came upon CSIR, believe it or not, to mechanize agriculture. And these stories are aware to everyone. The second story about CSIR was there was a very large incidence of infant death in India, in modern India. The children who were just born were actually dying even before turning 1 or something like that. And that was a combination of causes because of non-lactating mothers or mothers had died during pregnancy or whatever. And the solution that was thought to give them was protein-rich food, or rather milk. If you could provide children, then probably we could reduce the number of infant deaths at that particular point of time. Now the milk was, major milk was produced by this association of dairies called the Kaira Milk Association in Bombay and Gujarat at that particular point of time. But the cold chain network did not exist to take this milk all over the country. And therefore, this remained a nagging problem. So at that time, a committee was formed somewhere around 1957, something called a Krishan Chand Committee. Krishan Chand was the joint secretary in Ministry of Commerce and Food at that particular point of time. And the committee invited several international experts, as we would have it, from Switzerland, New Zealand, Ireland, and so on and so forth. And they wrote down in the report that Indian milk, if it has to be transported efficiently all across, it has to be converted into milk powder. If you convert milk into milk powder, then you will be able to actually carry milk all over the place very easily. But they noted that Indian milk cannot be converted into powder because it forms clumps. And it forms clumps because it's high in fat. And it's high in fat because predominantly in India, we use buffalo milk. And in other countries, European countries and Australia and New Zealand and all, they predominantly use the cow milk. And therefore, the committee's report says that this problem is not solvable because converting buffalo milk into powder cannot be solved. So this is the recommendation of the committee. But of course, we had people, thanks to our scientists, One of the persons, of course, is none other than Verghese Kurian. All of you have heard the name of Verghese Kurian. But other person was V. Subramaniam. Probably many of you would not have heard of V. Subramaniam. He was the director of CFTRI in Mysore. Verghese Kurian decided to take this report to Subramaniam. They sat together and Subramaniam told him, don't worry, our scientists are capable of finding a solution. Right? And the biochemists in the audience would know that to separate fat from soluble content is not rocket science. Right? All the biochemists in the audience would know that by centrifugation, you can actually separate the soluble and insoluble part, and that was very easy, and they actually could show that it was possible to do that. After separating the fat, the milk that remained now could be converted into milk powder very easily. And that's the Amul milk powder that is prevalent even today. The milk powder that you take is a technology that was developed in CFTRI using this particular process, that you separate fat and using the milk, you make milk powder. In the early days, till about 1980s or 1990s, Amul used to sell milk powder in those tin boxes. People of my age would remember the tin box in which Amul milk powder used to come. There used to be a logo of CSIR on the top of that. It's not only Amul, but CSIR used to be printed on the top of the cover. That is developed in CSIR. And our mothers, they used to use this milk powder because the milk was in shortage in general. And after the milk powder was over, our mothers used to store dal and all in that. I don't know whether you remember that. And when the tin actually rusted, we stopped storing dal in that. We started storing washing powder and all in that, if you remember. So that was the thing. They used to come with CSIR stamp. But how do you show this milk is fit for consumption? There's another challenging problem, right? So it could not have been implemented in the field without showing that it's fit for consumption. So what would CSIR do? CSIR gave a grant for conducting clinical trials of this milk powder and to show that it is fit for human consumption. So clinical trials were conducted in CMC Vellore with Verghese Kurian and V. Subramaniam as the principal investigators. They went to CMC Vellore, they conducted clinical trials and showed that it's fit for consumption. And it's only after that that it became a common man's this thing. Now, I can actually go on narrating this story with the details of this for a long time. And I had my chance to narrate this in Delhi once. I had my glorious chance. One of the glorious chances that I had in Delhi was in a meeting where about 20 IS officers were sitting around a table. And they did not know, our IS officers are terribly unaware of what has happened in modern India. So they have no clue how India has developed since 1947. And I have been pressing at this moment that in the Masuri Academy, when the IS officers go there, they must be given at least 30% course on science and technology. And hopefully I'll be successful in the next few months when I have convinced the government to do that. So 20 secretaries around a table, and they looked at me and said, "Oh, देश के लिए science ने क्या क्या बताओ यार, हम लोग सब बाहर से ले आते." So my moment came when the tea was being served. So I asked a very seemingly innocuous question that ये दूध आप जो चाय में मिलाते हो ना, ये क्या पैकेट से लेके उबाल के इसमें दूध डालते हो क्या? So all of them laughed. Said, नहीं, हम तो powder डालते हैं. I said, okay, this is my moment. Let me tell you the story of milk powder. And I narrated this story to them. And they were taken aback. They said, wow, we didn't know. I said, I can go on. I can tell you 100 stories. Milk powder is only one story. And I can tell you stories of CSIR, what CSIR has done. And I can tell you 100 of them. You challenge me. Every day I will come and tell you a new story. So this is how actually it is. That's how terribly unaware our IS officers are. Now, similar thing happened just when I was leaving last year. I retired on 30th April. And I was paying courtesy calls to some of the very senior officials in Delhi, people with whom I had worked, very, very senior people. And one of them I went, and I was continuously being told that कि CSIS की आधी लैब को आप बंद कराओ. These very senior people कि क्या होता है CSIR में, कुछ होता नहीं है, आप बंद कराओ. And I was standing my ground कि कुछ बंद नहीं करेंगे. So this person that day once again told me कि हाँ आपको कितनी बार बताया कि बंद कराओ, बंद क्यों नहीं कर रहे? So I gave him a list of 37 labs. I said कि sir, you put your finger on any of the labs. Okay, I challenge you and I will tell you what this lab has done. And as luck would have it, he put a finger on CBRI Roorkee. Okay. I told him, sir, chalo, let me give you stories of CBRI Roorkee. So I told him that a couple of years ago, there is a very devastating earthquake in Nepal. And Nepal was looking at a friendly country like India to rebuild its infrastructure. Right? Many new buildings had to be constructed. School buildings, hospitals, universities, libraries, and so on and so forth. And Nepal looked up to India for providing that expertise in making earthquake resilient structures. What did Government of India do? Government of India gave job to CBRI Roorkee. And hundreds of those buildings were made in Nepal by CBRI Roorkee. Our people went there and stood on the ground. And today, many of the hospitals which are earthquake resilient have been made by CBRI. All right? Many of the schools that are now made, primary schools, secondary schools and all, have been made by CBRI. And I told this to him. I said, let me tell you one more. I said, during COVID period, do you remember that there was shortage of hospital space? There's so many hospitals in the country which ran out of bed. Who do you think went on ground and made hospitals at a notice of 7 days? I said, you talk to Punjab Chief Secretary. At that time, she was the Chief Secretary of Punjab, Vinnie Mahajan. Today, she is the Jal Shakti Secretary. I said, she told me the Punjab situation. I told her, give us 7 days. We'll make number of hospitals in Punjab. And we did. 500 bed hospitals in one place, 100 bed hospital another, and entire Himachal. If you happen to go to Himachal Pradesh, do stop by Kangra Hospital or things like that. If you go to Delhi, do stop by at the Safdarjung Hospital. And you will see a hospital made outside by CSIR and done at a notice of about 7 days. And these hospitals, although they are called makeshift hospitals, they are good for next 25 years. And they are full hospitals with all facilities, ICU, oxygen lines, ECG machines, and everything together. And I told this to person. I told him, I will give you a third example. Right? I mean, this very senior official, he had actually put his finger on CBRI, right? So I said, you have given me a chance, I'm going to go on telling stories. And I had challenged you, you put your finger on any lab and I will tell you stories. So I said, when the destruction of Noida Twin Towers came, right? Who would be expert that government would look at? Do you think our PWD? Or do you think our Ministry of House and Affairs? Or do you think any of your IS officers would have expertise to tell you how Twin Towers can be brought down vertically? I said, I challenge you, get any of your IS officers and tell me whether he can go and supervise. I said that job came on CBRI. And our people, our scientists, stood on ground and made sure that the Twin Towers in Noida that Supreme Court had ordered, they came down vertically with no damage to any of the surrounding structures. Isn't that amazing? It's super. And what we actually have been doing in the society, and as I said, I can go on giving stories of different labs and I can make easily 100 stories out of this. But the thing is, most people are unaware what our scientists and technologists have done in post-independent India. And last 75 years, we have seen any progress compared to any other nation that became independent plus minus 5-10 years. India stands alone in that, which has made so much progress, right? We have not seen a single famine since 1947. 1965 was a famine-like situation, which we averted by taking a number of measures. But today, we are a food surplus country. By and large, our immortality rate, or rather the average lifespan, has gone up over the years. By and large, our disease profile has changed. So what used to be actually devastating things, by and large, our education pattern has changed. So what we have done since 1947, actually we should be very proud of. We can always say that, oh, we still have not this, we still don't have this, a lot of people still don't have access to water and this and that. Many of us can go on criticizing ourselves, but don't forget that we are the single country which has made so much progress since 1947, plus minus 10 years. About 60 or 70 countries became independent around that time. And the sole reason we could do it is because we implemented science and technology as the growth vehicle. And that's exactly what we want to do in what today we call as Amrit Kal. The next 25 years, we must once again recommit ourselves to science and technology and its application to society. And I'm pretty sure in next 25 years, we'll actually be considered as one of the major global economies around the world. But not only that, our science and technology with a human face would actually be a model for the world. Our dream for the future is to make science and technology and integrate with humanity, with our own feelings and soul and everything, so that science and technology actually is a human face or a human manifestation of what we try to want to do, understand about nature. And not merely just understand the materialistic part of nature, the way we have been taught science and technology till now. So if we are able to do that, I'm pretty sure that we have a great time ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed a delight. As it was predicted correctly by our director, ma'am, there was more to science and history to take from this talk, and it was, as correctly promised by Dr. Mande, it was provoking with respect to two aspects. First one, to feel proud to be a part of CSIR organization, and second, to feel our responsibility towards our country. Thank you so much, sir. And from being an efficient leader in shaping the strategy to mitigate COVID, to being a wonderful orator, you have always been inspiring us, and we are all big fan of you. And thank you so much for being here and for the great lecture. Thank you so much. I request our director, ma'am, to kindly felicitate our guest of honor. Ma'am? Definitely, ma'am. Just a second, we'll arrange the mic. Just a minute.
Many women went into medicine, to practice medicine, work for the poor, and so on and so forth. In science, though, the entry of women, even with C.V. Raman, he was himself very conservative, as we all know. It was very difficult for a woman to enter his lab and work. So these people, many of them had very conservative views. They were brilliant scientists, of course, but as far as women were concerned, they were often quite conservative. What is your take on the influence of the freedom struggle and the entry of women into science and technology? How long did it take? How easy it was, or was it not?
See, so
Which women
if you look at a very specific question of role of women in society, I think all over the world, women face very similar issues. We were probably not isolated. Even in Britain, what prides itself as one of the major science and technology power, women were actually not given equal participation in science and technology, even in those era. The stories of Rosalind Franklin and all are very well known to everyone else. What we should be thankful is that there are many women who actually persuaded society to actually get into it. And CSIR's most famous case, of course, is that of Janki Amal. So Janki Amal was a scientist in IIIM Jammu, then RRL Jammu. And she actually brought plant systematics very strongly in the country. But C.V. Raman, because you mentioned, the person who struggled with C.V. Raman was none other than Kamala Soni. And Kamala Soni, of course, persuaded C.V. Raman to have a different look. And whether C.V. Raman was persuaded or not on this particular issue, we don't know. But nonetheless, he eventually promoted people like Anna Mani and all. And they actually led Indian science very gloriously in the following years. Although Kamala Soni did not eventually did not do her PhD with C.V. Raman. She went to Cambridge. But nonetheless, that actually they were women of substance who did actually try that. And some of the best known examples of promotion of science were people like Sister Nivedita and Sarah Chapman Bowles, who was actually taken over by Vivekananda's philosophy. And they actually really, in a true sense, wanted to support scientific thinking and all in India. So there are some very glorious examples of women who actually did participate in that time, the example that I mentioned. But as I said, we were not isolated. Then many other countries things were something similar, even in places like Europe or US and things like that. But hopefully things are changing now, and hopefully we will actually do better in the next 25 years. Would that answer? Huh?
The question is not about women this time. The question is that, the powers that be were colonial powers. There were people working in Science Institute, say the Bose Institute, which is now the Bose Institute, or the IISc and so on. How many of these scientists took open positions against colonialism?
Open?
Positions against colonialism. It's all right to cry in a I'm being provocative, to cry in a Nobel Award ceremony. It's apart from Meghnad Saha, who was very vocal in his criticism of the British government, how many people took open positions against colonialism at that time?
So I think the popular feeling is that the freedom people who participate in freedom struggle are the only ones who came on the streets and either threw bombs at the British or peacefully protested and went to jail. I think we have to take a position that Britain was ruling over India with their scientific prowess, and therefore it was important for us to build our own scientific prowess in the country to counter the British. Now that was the general underlying feeling amongst all of them, right? I mean, many of them who actually had this particular feeling. P.C. Ray, for example. Now, P.C. Ray would not have gone out on the street and shouted against the British, but nonetheless, he actually is on record saying that unless we develop scientific temper in India, we'll not be able to actually counter British in their particular way. So there's other school of thought. The scientists actually participated in a way to counter the British by building a counter narrative which was anti-British.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Do you think that scientists, because they have the privilege of such, of education and powers of critical thinking, that they have an added responsibility to participate in social justice or to be involved in some sense? I mean, does the science have to have any social justice agenda somehow integrated in what scientists do? Can we really see ourselves in isolation?
Yeah, so the question is difficult to answer. In the past, scientists have indeed participated in political processes in trying to convince others that rational thinking can actually get over some of the prejudices and biases in society. One of the best examples, of course, is Meghnad Saha himself. He was a member of parliament. He contested election and he was a member of parliament. He was also the one who actually started planning commission and things like that. So many of these people actually did participate in policy formations and things as such. But scientists in general, I mean, I hope all of you will agree with me, are poor communicators. So even if we have conviction about certain matters, to communicate that to the society in general, I mean, that's my view, maybe I'm wrong, is actually, we don't do it in an effective language what we should do. All of us are convinced that there has to be equality in society. Right? I mean, I don't think in this audience anyone disagrees with this particular aspect. Equality at all respects, right? I mean, irrespective of whatever you have, whether the faith or the color or language you speak or geographic religion that you come from, we want to actually see society as diverse as possible. But to convince the society on this requires a skill which is very different. I mean, and probably some of us lack that particular skill. But nonetheless, because we have been endowed to think rationally, so it would be a good thing if actually we articulate some aspects of society in the manner that we can do rationally. So that's indeed a welcome thing.
May I now invite Dr. Bhavana to kindly propose vote of thanks.
Let's thank Dr. Shekhar Mande for taking time out of his busy schedule and visiting CDRI. Sir, we want to hear more of these inspiring stories. Please visit us again. I also want to thank our director, Dr. Anand Kulkarni, Dr. Shruti Raju, Mr. Sumit Srivastava, Mr. VP Singh from Scientific Directorate Office, Mr. Arvind Kumar and team, Mr. Ravindranath and Kazim for arranging and coordinating everything perfectly and making this event successful. I want to thank Dr. Ravi Shankar also for his help. And I thank all of you to be part of this celebration. The science of today is the technology of tomorrow. Happy National Science Day. we have reached end of this session. Now I request all of you to please rise for national anthem, followed by tea outside. Thank you.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे